After the final defeat of the Huns in 454 and the collapse of their superpower, the situation in Central Europe changed greatly, and although the Western Roman Empire, which was living its last days, was no longer warm or cold, the Eastern Empire was greedily rubbing its hands, and with the help of favorable offers, drew the fragments of the Huns' power into its zone of influence. One of such fragments, favored by the Romans, was an association of Pannonian Goths living near Lake Balaton, misunderstood by historians called the Kingdom of the Ostgoths. In reality, no kingdom at that moment there was no smell, rather a tribal confederation, where as a result of a fierce struggle of the leaders of the Gothic tribes to the very top, got out three brothers, Valamir, Theodomir, and Vidomir of the Amalov family, ruling three parts of the kingdom as a conditionally unified whole. After the collapse of the Huns' power, its various splinters began a fierce struggle with each other for the looted goods during the existence of the power. Eastern Romans, having looked at all this, have addressed to Goths and have offered those the status of federates with constant payments of money from a bottomless purse of Constantinople if they will manage to fix themselves and to repel Pannonia from other barbarians. As a guarantee of fulfillment of obligations, Ostgoths sent to Rome as a hostage the senior of sons of brothers, Theodoric, son Theodomir. Such exchange was an ancient and established practice of relations between Romans and barbarians. A stronger party took important hostages from a weaker one, ensuring stability of fulfillment of the agreement under the threat of the hostage's death. In the case of the Goths sent as hostages, the most likely heir to his father's power provided a guarantee of non-attack of the Goths on the empire. Thus, with Theodoric in Constantinople also worked. Children of barbarians were taught the Roman way of life, introduced to the local religious life, showed all the achievements of civilization and the power of the empire. Usually such an impact made the right impression, and returning to their own, the barbarian became a guide of Roman values, much more malleable because of the desire to return back to civilization. In the case of Theodoric, however, this scheme failed somewhere. No, Theodoric really appreciated the Roman way of life and wanted to join it on more reliable terms than the Romans could offer at that moment. In 470, Theodoric, who had grown up, was sent back to the Ostgoths with gifts and a request from Emperor Leo I. In the intervening time, the Constantinople authorities had forgotten their part of the bargain and decided that the pittance they paid to the Pannonian Goths was more necessary than the empire itself. Therefore, when on borders of empire began to press Sarmatians, emperor has decided to renew the contract with Goths. For what? And has sent Theodori with gifts. On arrival at his kinsman, the young Goth, as a future leader, was immediately appointed as a commander in a raid against the Sarmatians. The success of this enterprise greatly raised his prestige and made his words more weighty, and he had much to say. In the 10 years since the treaty with the empire, the situation of the Goths in Pannonia had not improved. Its resources were increasingly depleted. The pressure of other tribes was increasingly felt. In one of the localized and nothing decisive skirmishes, Valamir died. It was obvious that in the future it would be even harder to at least keep what he had already conquered, and therefore the question was urgent: what to do next? Theodoric had an answer to this question. The empire, though, renewed the treaty with the Pannonian Goths, but could at any moment and break it, as it had happened before. Therefore it was necessary not only to force the Romans to accept the new treaty, but also to do it on their own terms. According to one version of the tribe decided to split. One part, led by Vidomir, will go towards Italy, as a weaker and therefore pliable part of the empire. At this time, the second part, led by Theodomir, will go to the Balkans to rob them and provide the Goths with money. According to another version to which I am inclined, Theodomir from the very beginning was going to go to the Balkans, not for the purpose of robbery, but in order to achieve the settlement of the tribe on the Roman territory. He persuaded his brother and part of his men to go to Italy so that they would not prevent him from establishing sole authority over the remaining tribe. The calculation was correct. Vidomir and his Goths perished somewhere on the road to Italy. The whole operation was a gamble, but Theodoric, who was well aware of the current situation in the empire, was able to convince his father that there was a chance of success. Even during the onslaught of the Huns, the Romans took in federates part of the Ostgoths and settled them in Thrace, thereby reducing the army of the Huns and getting additional troops. The Thracian Goths were paid much more than the other federates for their service due to their usefulness and loyalty. In normal times, of course, a Goth invasion would have elicited the standard reaction: smash, slaughter the survivors, disperse the survivors into the hinterland. Except that the situation was highly unusual, and the Goths of Theodomir and Theodoric had a small window of opportunity before them, which they decisively seized. The state of the imperial court in Constantinople, and on the best of days, was more like a tangle of snakes, where everyone fought with everyone else in a desire to rise to the highest rung of power, or at least to grasp the edges of the garment of the one who is already on it. On the throne, as has already been said, sat the Emperor Leo I, and all would have been well with him. But Leo's life was poisoned by the fact that he took the throne largely thanks to the all-powerful patrician Aspar. Aspar's influence was immense. Allan by birth, he had risen through the wars as a successful warlord and schemer. It was he who ensured the rise to power first of all of Marcian and then of Leo I, with whom he was also related. One of the bases of such a powerful influence of Aspar were not only numerous connections in Constantinople, but also almost sole command of the army of the empire. Aspar promoted to the highest command positions in the army of his protégés, most of whom were his relatives or allied Thracian Goths. The Thracian Goths and Aspar had common interests. Aspar needed his own people in the army, and the Goths needed to promote their people to high positions to increase their political weight. So logical in such a situation, the alliance was formalized through a dynastic marriage with a relative of the leader of the Thracian Goths, Theodoric Strabo. Interference in the high politics of the Thracian Goths was quite understandable. According to the Treaty of the Federates, they received a rather privileged position and were afraid that in time they might lose it. Therefore, the patronage of Aspar was for the Goths Theodoric Strabo a favorable acquisition for their own quiet future. However, there was a risk. Binding themselves so closely to a particular politician, in case of his departure from the arena and the defeat of his party, the Goths could lose everything. And just as Aspar's position began to deteriorate, Emperor Leo I, in the struggle with the Gothic party, made reliance on the Isaurian commander Zeno. The Isaurians were a semi-barbarian tribe living on the border with Persia. They began to be actively recruited into the army because of the Hun threat. Being also a kind of federates, the Isaurians were dissatisfied with the all-powerful position of the Goths, and therefore sought an alliance with those who opposed Aspar and his party. The emperor brought Zeno closer to him and even gave him his daughter in exchange for help in overthrowing the hated warlord. The crisis was brewing for 5 years and ended with the murder of Aspar right in the imperial palace, despite the personal guarantees of security given earlier by Leo. For such an act, Leo was nicknamed the Butcher. If only they knew what kind of butcher the next emperor would be. By the way, having got rid of Aspar, Leo I has not received any freedom, as now completely depended on Zeno. Immediately, as news of Aspar's murder reached Thrace, the Goths Theodoric Strabo revolted, demanding Aspar's inheritance. Many of Aspar's allies fled to Strabo, and in fact the whole rebellion aimed to force the authorities of Constantinople to recognize the possible existence of the Gothic party, not to cut it out, as was usual. So it was not a typical barbarian revolt, but rather an army revolt. By this time the Pannonian Goths had already entered the territory of the empire and were there just in time. The rebellion of the Thracian Goths opened for the Pannonian Goths an opportunity to intervene in this conflict. If they showed themselves as more favorable allies, it would be possible to take the place of the Thracians as Constantinople's favorite federates. The central government, which had first tried to suppress the revolt of the Thracian Goths by force, was faced with 2 simultaneous crises. And although that the Thracian Goths and Pannonian Goths had no more than 10,000 soldiers each, and Rome could field an army of at least 40,000, but it would require weakening other directions, which was undesirable. So when the hostilities against Theodoric Strabo and Theodoric Amalus did not result in a quick resolution, imperial diplomacy did what it always did. It came to an agreement. At the same time, embassies were sent to the Goths of Thrace and Pannonia. Thracians recognized their old merits and offered a new treaty on which Theodoric Strabo became commander-in-chief in the Balkans, then introduced into the supreme military command of the empire. Thus the situation returned to the original one before the rebellion. Moreover, the new treaty clearly stipulated that the Goths could have only one king, and that was Theodoric Strabo, which once put him in conflict with Theodoric Amal. On the other hand, the Pannonian Goths were offered conditions of compact settlement within the Balkan part of the empire, which on the one hand Theodoric wanted, but on the other hand, it was clearly recognized that the favorite federates here, Thracians and Pannonians, are simply tolerated, which for any barbarians usually meant one thing: massacre. Because of such an ambiguous situation, the Pannonian Goths began to slowly defect to the apparent king of the situation, Theodoric Strabo, who was able, thanks to Roman payments, to promise significant rewards. It seemed that the stake in the great game, conceived by Theodoric and his father, was beaten. But in Constantinople, Leo I dies suddenly, and his 6-year-old grandson, Leo II, who was Zeno's son, becomes his heir. A couple months later, Leo II appoints Zeno as co-emperor, and then mysteriously dies. As a result of all this combination, the old deal with both Gothic factions hung in the air. The new emperor Zeno was an opponent of the Thracian Goths, and therefore was not going to fulfill in principle the deal with Theodoric Strabo. What did Strabo do then? Right, the same thing that any Byzantine would have done: joined the conspiracy against Zeno. As Zeno did not have any rights on a throne, against it at once the conspiracy from the widow of Lion I, her brother Basiliscus, to whom and intended to give a throne, and the commander Isaurus Illus, hostile to Zeno, was formed. The newly appointed emperor, realizing that with such opponents at it nothing will work out, has slipped out of city and has hidden in a mountain fortress in Isauria, where has begun to collect around itself supporters. Since it was dangerous to leave Zeno alive, Illus was sent to fight him. The latter actually besieges the fortress with the fugitive emperor. Somewhere on the way, captures his brother and, using him as a hostage, begins negotiations. As a result, Zeno and Illus agree on an alliance. At the same time, Theodoric managed to establish contact with Zeno and promised him support in exchange for the lands of the Thracian Goths. The impossible alliance took place, and the playing field was once again reversed. Strabo was forced to move his troops into Thrace to meet the horde of Pannonian Goths. Basilisk was forced to hand over the command of the remaining army to his nephew Armatus, but he too defected to Zeno's side, after the promise to make his son heir to the throne. That's it. Basilisk has played all the cards in his hand and lost. Zeno promises not to kill the loser Basilisk and his family. They will be simply walled up in a room without food and water. Having established himself again on the throne, Zeno, as well as a year and a half earlier, found himself in not the most pleasant position. Though he had a pact with Illus, he could not trust him, which meant the army had questionable loyalty by default. Theodoric Amal never engaged in a direct confrontation with Theodoric Strabo and was busy maneuvering around him and plundering imperial territory. Finally, there was also Armad, who had a vague claim to the throne, and Zeno's promise to appoint his son as heir to the empire. This tangle of troubles the emperor decided to unravel one thread at a time. First, he eliminated Armad. The next problem was the Goths. Actually, because of the power struggle, the empire could not solve their problem. Zeno was not going to fulfill the terms of the deal with Theodoric Amal. In words, he promised him money, reinforcements, and guides for the final attack on Theodoric Strabo. In fact, the money was delayed somewhere. The reinforcements were promised to be on the spot, but did not appear. And the guides, in addition to leading Theodoric by the most difficult route, so also led directly to Strabo's camp, and not to the assembly point of the imperial troops. At the same time, the camp of Strabo appeared in this place also absolutely not accidentally, and after negotiations with Zeno. Simply speaking, Emperor of Constantinople intended to stratify two enemies. But both Theodoric, this intrigue has unraveled and refused to fight. That even worse for genius intriguer Zeno, armies mobilized for achieving survivors Goths, it was necessary to send on winter apartments. The reason for this was Zeno's quarrel with Ilus and the subsequent attempt to eliminate the warlord by sending assassins. As a result, a mousetrap for Gothic mice appeared discharged and useless, and the situation in Constantinople persuaded both Theodorics to show restraint and to wait, accumulating forces. Already after the failure of the plan with the Goths, a second attempt was made on Ilus and again unsuccessful. Since most of the commanders were loyal to Ilus, it was impossible to remove him from the command in the open, and there was no hope for the loyalty of the army. This and took advantage of the Goths. Theodoric Strabo went to his native Thrace, where he began to recruit an army again, expecting its use soon, and Theodoric Amal, having no native home behind him, decided to play extortionist. First he approached the walls of Constantinople, where he demanded from Zeno apologies for deceit last year. Apology, of course, did not follow. On offers to settle the Goths in any region of empire, and to Theodoric and his soldiers to give the purpose for war, the refusal has followed, as much worse situation already could not be made. Having received nothing, Theodoric quickly marched westward and captured the strategically important port of Dyrrhachium, strengthening his negotiating position. The empire had not been able to solve the problem for 7 years. Even before Theodoric's capture of Dyrrhachium, Zeno and Strabo managed to agree again on an alliance. There was no talk of any trust, but the common enemy in the person of Pannonian was ready. This alliance did not last a few months because Strabo, realizing the rotten essence of Zeno, entered into a conspiracy against him in order to put on the throne grandson of Emperor Marcian and even married to the daughter of Leo I. The conspiracy was revealed in time, and in the city began mopping up. Strabo, together with his soldiers, was supposed to provide the force component of the conspiracy, but did not have time and arrived at the walls of the capital too late. When Zeno asked him why he had come, he replied that he was on his way to save the legitimate emperor. The fact that it is a brazen lie realized all, and therefore the alliance of Thracian Goths and Zenon again broke up. Zenon, to switch off from Game Strabo for a time, has hired Bulgarian for attack on Thrace. At this time, the army of Empire tried to lead a siege of Dyrrhachium. But Strabo, having suddenly easily scattered the Bulgars, gathered the army again and moved on the capital with the intention to take it. No doubt it was a bold move, but even though much of the empire's forces were in the Western Balkans, Ilus had enough warriors in the city to repel all attacks. Strabo was probably waiting for another coup attempt, but it failed. Then he withdrew his troops to the west, probably deciding to lift the siege of Theodoric Amalus and thus gain popularity among his Goths, but on the way, he fell unluckily from his horse on his own spear. Zeno, when he learned of this, must have declared a holiday, for the task of eliminating his enemies became much easier. Now, already to Theodoric Amalus, Zeno offered a bargain, making him Magister Militum Praesentalis, so that he would defeat the Thracian Goths led by Strabo's son Resitacus. In 482, Theodoric defeated Resitac and united the Goths under his leadership. But not only for this, Zeno needed peace with Theodoric. After another attempt on Ilus's life, where he dared to survive again, the Isaurian commander realized that it was time to follow the example of his chief and fled to a mountain fortress in Isauria. To fight the rebels Zeno sent, including the Goths, and for Theodoric's loyalty, he gave him the post of consul, which was generally a first for a barbarian without Roman citizenship. But Theodoric, who had already been deceived twice by Zeno, learned his lessons and realized that the next after Ilus would be him. Since to overthrow the emperor of forces he would not have enough, there was only one way out: to flee. Goths raise a rebellion, the condition for the termination of which is the organization of their military expedition to Italy against the traitor, Odoacer, in order to restore the power of the empire there. Zeno tried at first to solve a question by military methods, again has hired Bulgarian, then has withstood a siege in Constantinople, and only after that has passed to diplomacy. It sounds crazy, but for Zenon, which already tired of all this and wanted at last to begin normal political cleansing, it was already all the same on what to agree, the main thing that Goths have removed from limits of empire, and further let at least with Satan fight. According to the agreement, Theodoric, after the victory over Odoacer for his labors will rule instead of the emperor until he arrives there. This formula quite satisfied everyone, and 20,000 warriors of Goths and 100,000 people from their families went into the unknown. After many battles and hardships, the Goths will complete the conquest of Italy, but the empire will get nothing from it, except moral satisfaction. The great Gothic game is over. Soon Theodoric, with the help of war and diplomacy, will create his Gothic Roman Empire, which will cover Spain, Italy, Gaul, and part of the Balkans. But as quickly as this empire will be created, so quickly it will fall under the onslaught of the Second Rome, which threw off the torpor of inaction. But that's another story.